Hello, my name is Reese Waters and welcome back to Learn Akkadian. Today we're going to talk about the in system. So we've mentioned in the past the G system, which is a set of patterns which give us the basic meaning of a verb. So here you can see the G system infinitive, sharakum, which means to steal. And we get this meaning based off the pattern in which these three root letters, which carry the meaning of stealing, are arranged into. So here you can see our in system infinitive, nashrukum. And as you can see, the exact same root letters are used, but in a different pattern, which is going to give us a different meaning. So where the G system infinitive is going to mean to steal, the in system infinitive is going to mean to become stolen. Now that's because the in system gives the word a passive or an ingressive meaning. These two meanings for the in system, passive and ingressive, vary whether or not the verb is transitive or intransitive. Now a transitive verb is a verb that takes a direct object. So for example, if I said, the king hit his servant, this verb hit would be taking a direct object, therefore the verb is transitive. So that means if we were to find this verb in the in system, it would then take a passive meaning. Now passive meaning is a translation which rather than having the subject perform an action, the subject is going to be receiving that action. So rather than saying the king hit a direct object, the king is going to be the one receiving the action, so it would be the king was hit. Now, the ingressive translation we'll find with verbs that are intransitive. So, for example, damakum means to be good. So when this verb is placed into the in system, it would mean to become good, because that's the ingressive meaning. So to understand how the in system changes the meaning of root letters, let's look at some examples with the in system infinitive. And I've written here the pattern which all strong verbs, meaning verbs with three root letters, are going to take as an in system infinitive. So they're always going to have na at the beginning, followed by the first root letter, then the second root letter adjacent, then a u, and then the third root letter and Here we have the root letters P, R, and S from the word parasum, which means to divide. So if we were to find this as an in system infinitive, we would see naprusum, which would take on that passive meaning, giving us to be divided as our translation. If we take the root letters im, h, and sade from mahatsum, which means to beat in the G system, and we put this into the in system infinitive, we would get namhutsum, which means to be beaten. And again here we can see that the meaning is taking on that passive in system form. Here we have the root letters K, Shin, and R from kasharum, which means to have success, which as an in infinitive would appear as nakshurum, which here means to become accomplished. And here we can see this ingressive meaning which we find in the in system. So now that we understand how to form an in system infinitive, which we know gives us a passive or ingressive meaning of the root, like to become blank, let's look at how we form the durative, simple past, and perfect forms of the in system verbs. So we know that Akkadian verbs include prefixes and suffixes which tell us about the subject that agrees with the verb. Here, I have listed the in system prefixes and suffixes, which you'll notice are the exact same as the G system prefixes and suffixes. So here we have the first person common singular, which means I, a. We have the second person masculine singular, ta, which would mean you with a masculine subject. We have the second person feminine singular, which is ta with a long I added to the end of the verb stem, which is a feminine you. Then we have the third person common singular, which is a short I, and would mean he, she, or it, with this common just showing us that there's no particular gender carried for the subject. The first person common plural is ni, which would mean we as the subject. The second person common plural would be ta with a long A added to the end of the stem, and that would be like y'all. The third person masculine plural is an I with a long U added to the end of the stem, and that would mean like they with a masculine subject. And the third person feminine plural is an I with a long A added to the end, and that would be like they for a feminine subject. Now something important to note is when there's a mixed group of men and women, Akkadian is going to tend to use the masculine third person plural. So now that we've talked about what prefixes and suffixes we're going to find in the in system, let's talk about our verbal stems, which are going to tell us the tense of the verb. So we have the durative, which is the future or the present tense. We have the preterite, or the simple past tense, and we have the perfect. Here I've written out each one of our verbal stems for the different tenses of the in system. So that means that the prefixes and suffixes are still going to need to be added where I've put these dashes in order to get a complete verbal form. So here with our durative, you can see that the first root letter is doubled, as I've marked here, followed by an a doubling of the second root letter, followed by our first thematic vowel and our third root letter. In the preterite, we again see the first root letter is doubled. We have an A, then we have our second root letter, an I, and it's important to note that this is not a thematic vowel, but is always an I in the preterite of the in system, followed by our third root letter. Then in the perfect, we see a doubling of the perfect T, an A, our first root letter immediately followed by our second root letter, our first thematic vowel, and our third root letter. Now, a useful way to think about this is by thinking of the first letter of each stem as an N. So if I write that out for you, N, and I'm going to erase this first T, I'm going to replace it with an N. And then I give us a root. So in this case, we're going to use Shin, R, and Q from Shirakum, which we used as an example earlier when looking at the in infinitive, which was Nashrukum. And as you can see in this in infinitive form, it again begins with the N. So it's not too crazy to think that these stems might have originally begun with the N, and then after the root letters were added, Shin, R, and Q, Shin, R, and Q, and we have Shin, R, and Q, the N would then assimilate, giving us a doubling of the first root letter and a doubling of the perfect T. Now, scholars debate whether or not this is philologically why the in system actually appears as it does, but it's a useful way to understand it, and that's why I think it's good for helping us to learn how the in system works. Looking at the verb shirakum, which means to steal, let's go over how we would translate each tense of in system verb. So first we have the durative tense, which can be interpreted as either a future tense or present tense verb. And we have a doubling of the shin, a doubling of the second root letter R, a single Q, and we have this thematic vowel I, which I've added. And it's important to recognize this first root letter is doubled because that's the only thing which differentiates the G system durative from the in system durative. And as you can see, I've added an I to the beginning of each stem, meaning that we have a third person common singular subject. Now, because shirakum, to steal, is a transitive verb, these are each going to take a passive meaning. So rather than the subject performing the action of stealing a direct object, the subject is going to become the recipient of that action. So here, we would read esharik as he, she, or it will be stolen, being the passive recipient of the action stealing, or he, she, or it is stolen, which would be the present reading. For the preterite, or simple past, we would read esharik as he, she, or it was stolen, again, passively receiving that action. And for the perfect, itashrik, we would read this as he, she, or it has been stolen. So as you can see, each one of these is going to be read as the subject, he, she, or it, receiving the action. For our next example, we're going to look at the word shahatum, which has I and I as its thematic vowels, and it means to attack. So we know that this is a transitive verb, so each one of our translations is going to take on that passive meaning for the in system. You'll also notice that I've changed our subject because I've added a ta prefix and a a, long a suffix, meaning that our subject is going to be second person common plural, or y'all. So we would translate tashahita as y'all will be attacked, or y'all are attacked. And again, this is just that passive meaning where y'all, our subject, is not performing the action of attacking, but instead receiving the action. Our preterite, tashahita, is going to be translated as y'all were attacked, and our perfect, tatashita, is going to be translated as y'all have been attacked. Now let's look at some cuneiform to see how an in-system verb actually appears in Hammurabi's code. Here we have line 7 from Law 18 of Hammurabi's code. This first sign is going to be translated as ip. Our second sign is going to be translated as pa. Our third sign is going to be translated as r. Our fourth sign is going to be translated as ra. And our last sign is going to be translated as to. So here we can normalize to get Amraṣ. And as we can see, there's a doubling of this first root letter, a doubling of the second root letter, and a single third root letter. So this tips us off that this is going to be the durative form of the in-system verb coming from parasum, which means to divide. So our root letters are P, R, and S. Now if we put this into the G system infinitive, this would give us parasum, which we can look up in the dictionary to see that this means to divide. So as an in-system durative verb with this third person common singular subject, we could translate this as he, she, or it will be divided. Parasum also means to judge in the G system infinitive. And so a better translation would be he, she, or it will be judged. Now this makes sense based off the context of Law 18, because this law describes a slave who has escaped and has refused to name their master, and therefore they're taken to the palace to be judged. This shows us the importance of looking at the context of a verb when translating. A lot of verbs have multiple definitions, and so it can be important to find out a little bit of background on the sentence before we decide which definition is best to use. Now, another thing that requires some context can be when the in system occurs in the first place. Now, in this particular example, we see that there's a doubling of this first root letter, which is a very clear sign that this is a in-system durative rather than a G-system durative. But in theory, we could totally have this pa sign removed, and we could have just iparas, and we could be needing to double the P in order to form our in-system verb. Now, as we've talked about before, with the rules of normalization, we would never combine these two consonants when we're normalizing, but we could provide the double, even though there's only one listed in the cuneiform, if this sign's removed. So sometimes we have to look at the sentence, and while this would initially seem like a G-system verb, we could see that, okay, this is a slave who has been captured and they've been taken to the palace. So it's unlikely that the slave would be the one doing the judging. So based off that context, we could provide the second P in order to again get this in-system definition of he, she, or it will be judged. So now that we've been over the G system and the in system, I have a challenge for you. Based off these three signs, how many verbal forms can you discover from transliterating and normalizing? Now, this is just to demonstrate how much ambiguity there is within cuneiform texts. Based off these three signs, you're going to be able to get multiple different readings. And let me know what readings you can find in the comments below. Thanks for watching Learn Akkadian, and happy translating.